founder of The Hub, Ginny Roth. Great to have you back here at the roundtable.
It's nice to be back.
Well, let's talk where we're at today in the campaign. Autos obviously is going to be the big story. Mark Carney gets to cosplay at PM, going up to Ottawa for his meeting with his Canada-US sub-cabinet. What are the Conservatives going to do generally about Trump and tariffs? How do you think they should be pushing back when Trump kind of floods the zone when it comes to our election campaign?
Poilievre, I think, has a defensive imperative when it comes to strategy around Trump. He has to convince Canadians who are considering voting for him that he is opposed to Trump, he'll fight Trump, he's the best person to fight Trump, they can rely on him to fight Trump, and that he doesn't have anything in common with Trump or share his goals. But I don't, and so I think he has to do that. I think that's why you saw him with a sort of spontaneous press conference yesterday evening, where he responded to the tariffs to kind of drive exactly that messaging. But I think then it's pivoting immediately back onto what is his winning territory, which is strong domestic policy around cost of living and the economy. Still, many voters care about that more than they care about Canada-US, more than they care about Trump. And that is his winning territory. That's where if he wins the election, it's going to be there. It's not going to be on Trump. And so he sort of has a defensive job he has to do, is I think the way I'd put it.
Sean, maybe just break down for the listeners what David Coletto told you yesterday. A great YouTube video up on our site right now that really gets to this question of how Trump is a fulcrum, a foil around which this election and voters are going to spin for the next 32 odd days.
Yeah, it speaks precisely to the point that Ginny made and what it means for the Conservative campaign. Presently, something like 55 or 56% of Canadians believe that Trump and his threats to Canada represent the most important question looming over this election campaign. Among those who believe that, Ginny and Rudyard, about 50 or 55% say they would vote Liberal. Only about 25% say they would vote Conservative. On the other hand, as Ginny says, there's about 45% of Canadians who are motivated by change, who think that is the most important question looming over this election campaign. And just in parentheses, that number is about roughly the same level it was at in 2015 when, of course, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau defeated the incumbent Harper government with a majority. For those voters, those who are motivated by change, the numbers are precisely the opposite. About 55% of them would intend to vote Conservative, and only about 25% say they will vote Liberal. And so this speaks precisely to the conundrum that Jenny describes. On one hand, if this election campaign is about change, the Conservatives appear to be in the driver's seat. They have an advantage. The problem, of course, is Donald Trump seems determined to make this election campaign about him and his threats to the country as opposed to change. And at some point, Ginny, doesn't it become unsustainable for the Conservatives to keep talking about affordability issues, cost of living, what amounts to a change election, when the truth is that the rest of the country seems to be moving in the opposite direction, and one gets a sense that will only be supercharged after yesterday's tariff announcement and the tariff announcements that we're anticipating next week. I guess maybe just to sum all of that up, sometimes you get the election you want to have, other times you have to fight the election that's been decided for you. Isn't that increasingly the case for the Conservatives?
I think it's increasingly the case that the Conservatives cannot run a front-runner campaign. The campaign that you might have designed, the scripting, the platform, the rollout that you might have designed in November is probably not the campaign you want to run today. Now, this is where I will, I think, break with the orthodoxy of the analysis of what the Conservatives ought to do. Trying to ape the sort of competent, statesman-like persona that would not come naturally to Poilievre, frankly, and that the establishment seems to crave and like in Carney. I think it's just not the way to go. If you do that, you basically accept that that's the frame, and you are not the answer to that question. I think if you're Poilievre, what you have to do instead, and Sean, you kind of alluded to this on a conversation on Monday, much bolder policy on the issue that you can win on, which is cost of living and the economy. And of course, these issues are intertwined. It's a more complicated thesis to put forward, but the idea that we are so susceptible to these provocations from Trump because we are a weak country, economically, from a sovereignty and security perspective, et cetera. Like, that is true. It has the benefit of being true, as people say, right? And so if Poilievre can drive that question, which is not naive to the Trump issue, but drags the Trump issue into his corner, but he has to do it in a way that is bold. Like, I'll be honest, the announcements over the last couple of days around, the OAS age and even the TFSA announcement today, I'm not against these announcements, and they probably help bring some comfort to some middle-aged and older voters. But I don't think they drive the ballot question into his corner. I want to see incredibly bold policy on immigration that is way more hardline that Carney cannot match. I want to see a lot of that on the economy. Like, I want to see broader tax reform that almost makes people a little uncomfortable, that Carney cannot match, right? Yeah. Carney is holding together way too much. Carney has the opposite imperative of what Poilievre does, right? He has to be defensive on cost of living and economy, because if he's too weak on it, he'll lose voters. Make that hard for him. Bring out policies that he can't and won't match, because if he does, he'll lose voters to the NDP, and force him into that choice. That is what I would like to see. And I hope, there's still a long campaign to go, and Poilievre's a pretty bold guy, so I'm hopeful that we'll move in that direction.
Yeah. Sean, let's talk about younger people, because it's something you were writing about in the Hub today in our latest Need to Know feature. There are some obvious, to me, generational fault lines that are emerging in this election. They're emerging in the electorate in terms of support for Carney versus the Conservatives, and older boomers really rushing to the Liberals, including a lot of older Conservatives now going to Carney. Should we be surfacing this now? I mean, we're always comfortable talking about regional divisions in this country, Ontario versus Quebec versus Alberta. But boy, if I look at this election and I look at the issues that are on the table and what's really at stake for the single largest potential voting cohort out there, the millennials, where the heck is their voice in the policy announcements that we've heard since Monday?
Yeah, well said. Just yesterday, Rudyard, we had Brian Dykema on the show, and we talked about, among other things, the trend towards educational polarization. But there is something funny. We seem insecure or self-conscious talking about what is self-evidently a growing polarization along generational lines. And I agree. It's interesting, Roger, that the Conservatives aren't making a bigger play for those voters. Not just because not just because they're a significant group, but because we know, Roger, that they have a lower propensity to vote. And so it's one thing for 18 to 34-year-olds to tell pollsters that all things being equal, their political preferences match the Conservative Party in this race. It's another thing to make sure that they get out and vote in significant numbers. And so I'd almost put it to Ginny. Ginny, in 2015, the Liberal Party, of course, ran on, among other things, marijuana legalization, electoral reform, things that really animate that voter cohort. Are there anything in your mind, from a Conservative point of view, that could make sure that the Conservatives lock down the support that they're showing amongst this younger group of Canadians?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I'd throw out there. Rudyard pointed to millennials, and we have to remember how old millennials are now. Like, to me, the fault line, when I think about if there's an age war or demographic war between generations, the fault line is more like 50 or 55 even. And I think if the Conservatives said, look, we want as many voters under 50 to show up as possible and vote for us, that's a lot of voters. The millennial voting group is the biggest in Canada. No one thinks of 45-year-olds as non-voters. They might think of 25-year-olds as non-voters, but not 45-year-olds. And the other piece I would add is on the leadership campaign. I was on Poilievre's leadership campaign. We turned a lot of these people out at rallies, these young, more frankly, ethnically diverse voters who, as Conservatives, going back to the Harper era, we did not expect to see at our events. And we were very dubious that those people would convert to actual voters in the leadership campaign because of all the requirements to do it. And many of them did. Not all of them, but many voters who found Poilievre online, who were enticed by his messaging, who came to his rally, whose data we collected, turned out and voted for him in the leadership campaign. And to me, that is a proof point and some evidence that I mean, look, he's doing a rally in Surrey tonight. I expect it will be in the thousands. It will be very diverse. It'll be very young. And it will be people who are voting a townhouse, renting a townhouse in Surrey because they can't afford to buy a house in the greater Vancouver area. That is the cohort that he's won over to a certain extent. You have to make sure they vote. You have to make sure that they get a lawn sign, that they donate, that they convince their friend to vote. And so bolder policy on housing, bolder policy on cost of living, on inflation, all that stuff, like, to me, that is the path. And if it means that you further piss off, a centrist boomer who wasn't going to vote for you anyway, who cares, man?
Yeah, hear, hear. Sean, I know you were talking to Ginny's partner, Chad Rogers, in the last 24 hours, always a smart guy in these things, and he was saying the crowd sizes are not unimportant, and maybe you're getting kind of missed in all of our obsession about the polls and Trump and the news cycle. Unpack that line of argument for us.
Yeah, and I'd be grateful for Ginny's opinion on this. There does seem to be a dissonance, doesn't there? On one hand, polls are clearly moving in a direction. Abacus data, headed up by David Cleto, who, as you mentioned, we had on the show yesterday, seems to have been the last to finally fall in a series of dominoes, confirming liberal momentum, such that now I think every major polling company in the country has them out ahead. On the other hand, the energy behind the Poilievre campaign seems self-evidently higher. The rally in Hamilton this week is virtually unprecedented, and you juxtapose that with the older, more muted audiences that Mark Carney is producing across the country, and of course the essentially absent campaign of the New Democrats. How, Ginny, would you square the circle between the top line polling on one hand and the energy that we're seeing at Poilievre's rallies? Are the rallies in a way a canary in the coal mine for a greater momentum and energy behind the Conservative campaign than the polls may indeed be capturing?
And just before you answer that, Jenny, I think one thing I've been thinking about is just all the spade work that Poilievre has done over the last 3 years. I mean, how many tens of thousands of people's hands has he shaken?
There are a lot of Canadians who've met him
and
feel
exactly.
like I have a connection with this
And then
guy.
the contrast with Carney, who, I mean, great, he's put himself forward for elected office, kudos, but he's done this with no history of political public service, relative unknown. It seems to be helping him a little bit, frankly. But that's a real contrast between these two candidates.
Yeah, there are two components to the polling I would point out. One is what you're speaking to, Rudyard, I think, which is the Conservative vote is hard. Historically, Conservative vote in Canada has always been hard. It is more people are sure that they're going to vote Conservative and they are not changing their minds. The Liberal vote is soft. There are a lot of people right now saying that they'll consider voting Liberal or that they would vote Liberal if there were a vote today, but they are convincible. They are not hard voters. There's obviously a hard core to the Liberal vote, but much of it is not hard. So that's one component, and that's helpful as you think about strategy and who's moving and where they could go. The other aspect to the polling is you see the numbers you see in the sort of top-line messages that Liberals are doing well. People assume that means that it's at the expense of the Conservatives. But actually the Conservative number is not far off from the Harper high watermark of a majority government, right? In terms of what percentage, 38, something like that percent. And so that is both positive news for the Conservatives, but it also presents a real problem. Because when you think about the strategic levers you can pull, how do you convince voters who voted for Jagmeet Singh in the last election or the Bloc Québécois in the last election to vote again for those same parties in this election? They're not voting Conservative, but right now they're parking with Carney. I think for a bunch of reasons having to do with the comfort around the incumbent and the establishment in the context of Trump, et cetera, et cetera. Jagmeet Singh's weakness. The Bloc tends to be more of a protest vote. There are a bunch of reasons why that's happening, but the Conservatives can't control that. The thing they can control is motivating their own base. There are some voters who voted Conservative last time and are saying they might vote Liberal this time, and you want to win those back, especially the young ones, by winning on cost of living, I think. But but it's not some big battle between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And I think this is why you see the Conservatives fixating on Quebec, Carney's poor French, Carney's unwillingness to debate there, Carney's gaffes in Quebec. It's not so much about driving the Conservative number up, it's about driving that Bloc number up.
Right.
And if the Bloc number goes up, and if the Liberals, this is also why if the Liberals drop a little bit in the polls, that gives a bit of permission space, I think, for Bloc voters and NDP voters to say, maybe we can go back home. Like maybe there isn't. Maybe it's useful actually to keep the Liberals to a minority. Maybe I have permission to vote with my heart and not my head.
Yeah.
And Trump shutting up helps on that front too.
Yeah.
Roger, can I jump
Yeah,
in
yeah.
here? Ginny said something earlier that I want to pick up because I think that there's a ton of insight there, and that is the extent to which what we've seen so far, not just in this campaign, but really for the better part of the past several weeks, is Mark Carney trying to minimize the differentiation between the Liberals and the Conservatives on policy. I don't want to put you on the spot, Ginny, but what are, because this is something I've been thinking about too, what are, if not specific policies and policy areas where the Conservatives might be able to create that differentiation between themselves and Mark Carney? One area I've been thinking a bit about, what I know that you're passionate about, is crime and urban disorder. I think the Conservatives can push up against constitutional lines on criminal justice policies that the Liberals ostensibly won't match. In addition to that area, are there others you think that the party should be looking at?
Yeah. Well, think about progressive center-left shibboleths, right? Like think the Constitution is why, never using the notwithstanding clause, and how dare you, and the Globe and Mail editorial pages would go insane. That's one area. And I think that could be really powerful because it would force Carney to say, I'm for disorder, basically. I don't want to push back on the disorder you're experiencing in your streets. I think that's especially acute for middle-aged millennial voters. So I think that's a huge area. Immigration, I think, is a massive area where Liberals get very, very uncomfortable curtailing immigration too much. And I think Poilievre is very comfortable doing that. And if you look at the polling, the Liberals poll the worst on the issue of immigration. They are just not trusted on immigration. They've just recruited back their candidate who perpetrated the last 10 years of broken immigration policy. I think that's a huge area. But the policy has to be bold, right? It cannot be a sort of middle-of-the-road policy that Carney can easily match. I also think that climate versus economy question, you already see Carney has been forced to admit that he still favors an emissions cap, which is effectively a cap on growth. It's like a horrifying. We have one advantage in Canada, and it is our natural resources. And capping emissions effectively says I'm going to cap the extent to which we extract and exploit and produce those resources. So, and we know that average Canadians want that to happen and are disappointed that hasn't happened yet. So I think those are three category areas where I'd go really, really hard if I was Poilievre. And I think it's really important strategically. It cannot be the announcements today. It has to be new, and it has to be aggressive enough that it brings the fight, and that Carney has to or is tempted to, because of his coalition, oppose it.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It's a feeling like there's not a fight yet in this election. It feels
right.
like two campaigns or three campaigns, you want to add the NDP, that are just kind of on rails, and they're going forward. It's like the guns of August. The trains have left Germany and Austria and France, and they're just on the rails, headed towards the front. Just in our remaining moments, a bit of an indulgence on my part. I was texting with Sean Ginny last night, and we were sharing screenshots from the Globe and Mail, which yesterday did something quite remarkable. Every single story in the newspaper, from its news reporting to its editorial to its columnists to its letters to editors, was either studiously anti-Poilievre and studiously pro-Carney. It was a remarkable demonstration, I think, of what is supposedly our national newspaper effectively endorsing a candidate 30-odd days before the election.
Yeah, they've made an editorial choice. I think that's very clear. And it's too bad. I think we might have been lulled into a bit of a false sense of security in the later days of the Trudeau era, because the establishment had grown so tired of him that they were actually willing to give it to the Liberals a little bit and, frankly, tolerate Poilievre. I mean, since the Reform Party was founded, really, all of establishment Canada has had great distaste for the conservative movement. And Harper represented that in many ways. Poilievre definitely represents that. But they represent the interests of business, corporate Canada. And so Trudeau's policies became, I think, so bad for the economy, so self-evidently bad, that they were willing to push back a little bit on Liberal excesses. And now that that's off the table, and now that they've got Carney, who's sort of the perfect embodiment of everything they could want in a leader, the shamelessness with which they're licking their chops is, like, I think, a little bit uncouth. But that's fine. Conservatives are used to, I think, that environment, right? It's just a sort of a reversion to mean. And Conservatives can win in that environment. Harper did, and there's no reason Poilievre can't as well.
Yeah. Sean, it's just, I guess it seems like such a hoary kind of concept to talk about the establishment, in 2025. But boy, you do get the feeling, don't you, that there is an establishment in Canada that is in the media, that is part of large, powerful corporate interests, that is in Ottawa amongst the near state and the deep state and all the points in between. And you just kind of, I don't know, I'm a little sympathetic here in the opening of this campaign that the kind of Conservatives have shown up, at a gunfight with a pocket knife.
Just when it comes Sean to goes, I would also point out, like, who still consumes mainstream media? Mm-hmm. The boomers, right? Yeah. It is not a coincidence that the establishment media and the voices of the establishment and the ways that they access audiences are aligned with the Liberals, and that is the cohort that's voting Liberal. Yeah. And I think those audiences reflect it back to the media, and the media reflects it back to those audiences, and they end up in a bit of a weird echo chamber that is totally disassociated with a more online environment that is totally moved on.
Yeah. Sean, what's your take? I mean, am I exaggerating here the potential power of, quote, the establishment in the context of this election, and the establishment feeling that in Mark Carney, as Ginny said, they have their poster child?
No, I don't think you are. But I think there's a contingency here that probably limits our ability to make any universal judgments about what's played out. In the absence of the Trump threat, I'm not sure that the circling the wagon, circling of the ranks around Carney would be sufficient for the type of liberal momentum that we're seeing. It seems like this is the kind of perfect set of circumstances that have given the declining establishment one last gasp of power. But I would say, I think they need to be a bit prudential here, Rudyard. We've talked in the past about the extent to which there is real unhappiness in the country. I think a lot of that, frankly, is justified. You think, for instance, of the intersection between the Globe and Mail, Mark Watt, the Century Initiative, and others, and then ultimately the Liberal government pushing up immigration to levels that did real damage to the country. And so there's been no mea culpa. In fact, it's been a kind of doubling down, as Ginny says. And one wonders, even if they get the election outcome here that they want, if they may ultimately reach the conclusion that it wasn't worth the cost, because they may be doing irreparable harm to the public's trust and confidence in the institutions they lead. I'll just wrap up by saying this. We've been criticized by some over the past several weeks for raising concerns about a potentially contested outcome of this election campaign. And I think there's good reason to think that that the establishment would line up behind the Liberals in the event that the Conservatives win a plurality but not a majority of seats. And I just think that would be explosive across the country. And so one hopes that our so-called elite are able to exercise a bit of prudence in what would no doubt be a pretty explosive moment.
Yeah. Ginny, final question. I mean, how is it? I mean, you've been involved in a lot of campaigns. How is it that the entire Liberal record of these 10 years, as Sean said, you can go through multiple files. You've mentioned the economy. Sean talked about immigration. We could talk about Canada's diminished state on the world, the crippling of our resource sector through a series of policies that have scared off foreign investment and stifled productivity and job growth. Have you ever seen something like that, of that scale and size, just disappear, be like obviated in a matter of a couple of weeks, and a large cohorts of our fellow citizens, millions of them, basically saying, "Oh well, that happened. I guess, time for a do-over." It's kind of, to me, it's been shocking. It's been one of the slightly uncentering things of many that have gone on of late, that we can just somehow press delete on all that and just go on with a party that should have some culpability for what went before.
Well, I think, to your point, we haven't really had a debate yet in this election, which means that it's been a bit of a vibes election, and vibes can obscure what's really going on. And the people who are deleting that decade are the people who suffered the least in it. There are people who own their homes outright. There are people who own
big
stocks,
market gains,
exactly, and benefited in the context of inflation instead of feeling hurt. And so for them, it wasn't a lost decade. They were doing just fine, right? And those are the people who are excited about Carney. Really, there are still a lot of boomers in this country, and they tend to vote, and they're all supporting Carney. And then on the margins, where Carney seems to be getting a little bit of lift that is not deserved for the Liberals, for the party that perpetrated those policy disasters, he, I think, was very savvy, and I'll give him strategic credit for running away from the consumer carbon tax and the capital gains change very aggressively and very clearly from the beginning. I've said to a few people, I almost admire the level of shamelessness that requires. I certainly do not have the constitution for it. But that's the Liberal superpower. Their kryptonite is arrogance. And by the way, you see that coming through in spades. But their superpower is shamelessness. And it requires a level of shamelessness and just comfort speaking to Canadians as though none of this ever happened. And that's why I think it's imperative for the Conservatives to say the capital gains tax and the consumer carbon price are distractions. Here are all the ways in which we are still very, very, very different, and we have a very different plan for Canada.
Yeah. Sean, let's give you the last word in the show. We're going to say goodbye to Ginny, but then we'll stick around with our online audience to answer their questions that have been coming in over the last half hour to our chat. So jump into the chat now if you've got a question, or email us to livestream@thehub.ca. Sean?
Yeah, great conversation. It's always great to have Ginny on, isn't it, Roger? And I'm glad she brought expression to something I think a lot of Conservatives across the country are feeling, which is so far what we've seen out of the campaign is a little underwhelming. Pierre Poilievre became leader of the party and took off in the polls, not by talking about policy reform on the margins, but by presenting a theory of the case about the structure of Canada's economy, the extent to which it was marked by what he described as gatekeepers, which wasn't just bureaucrats, but it was also industries and firms that weren't subject to meaningful competition at the expense of consumers. And so to go from that big, audacious theory of the case and all of that it means for public policy to be offering marginal tax cuts or marginal tax credits or whatever just feels like a bit of a disconnect, and one happening at seemingly the worst time. It's a bit cliche, but there's the famous scene in the show The West Wing where someone scribbles "Let Bartlett be Bartlett," and it seems to me someone around Pierre Poilievre needs to write "Let Poilievre be Poilievre" and let the chips fall where they may. But I'd be prepared to bet that the Poilievre that we saw over the past couple of years is likely to perform better than the Poilievre that we've seen so far this week.
Yeah. Okay, Sean, we're going to say goodbye to our audience who've been listening to this as a Hub podcast, and we're going to continue with our live stream audience to answer questions. If you are on the podcast feed and tuning in, come on over each morning, 10 a.m. Eastern. We're doing this show live on YouTube. You can put your questions to Sean and me. We'll also get those to our guests from time to time. And of course, you can catch that same show on demand on YouTube, along with David Frum and all the other great video content that we have on our YouTube channel. Just simply look for The Hub Canada. So bye-bye. And